Get ready because this video is going to be very strange, but hopefully very interesting. But the central theme of this video is to ask the question, how do we know that a person that we see one day is the same one we meet the next day? Before I get into the neuroscience, I would like to tell you two stories. The first one starts in the misty spring of 1895 in a small Irish town, where a cooper named Michael Cleary lived with his wife Bridget and her father in a modest home. The townsfolk whispered of magic lingering in the soil, of fairies and witches who roamed under moonlight. Bridget, once a vibrant person, had fallen ill. Her feverish eyes and weakened frame created some unease in Michael's heart. He watched her closely, with his love twisting into suspicion. She looked like Bridget, spoke like her, but something felt wrong. Whispers of old tales filled his mind, stories of changelings, fairy impostors who stole human forms. Michael's father-in-law stepped in the same superstitions and reached the following agreement. Bridget was no longer herself, she was a changeling, a hollow mimic. And the only way to bring the real Bridget back, they believed, was to burn the impostor out. And so, on a fateful night, Michael gathered 8 neighbors, their faces lit by flickering firelight, and together they committed a horrible act. They set Bridget on fire, convinced they were saving her soul. The flames consumed her, and with them the truth of her identity. Bridget Cleary's murder by her husband was driven by delusion and folklore, and it became a haunting legend, a tragedy, but at the same time a reminder of how the human mind can fixate and act on completely incoherent premises. Let me tell you another story. Decades later, in 1923, a new chapter in the story of how our minds can enter a stage of delusion was starting to be written. This time, in the bustling streets of Paris, a 53-year-old woman, known only as Madame M, stood before the local police commissioner on the 3rd of June, 1918. Her voice was trembling with urgency. She claimed a sinister plot. Countless people, mostly children, were trapped in the basement of her home. She demanded the police investigate, but instead they escorted her to Hôpital Sainte-Anne, where her story took an even stranger turn. Madame M had no significant health history. She was relatively educated, married to a prosperous dairy merchant, yet she had endured an unimaginable loss. 4 of her 5 children, including 2 sets of twins, had died young. After their deaths, her husband noticed she was different. Jealousy, delusions of grandeur, and then something far more bizarre. She began insisting that he was not her husband. Her daughter, her neighbors, even the police were all impostors, identical in appearance, but not in essence. She spoke of transferences, of doubles replacing her loved ones. Her world became a maze of doppelgangers. Dr. Joseph Capgras, a French psychiatrist, and his intern, Jean Lachaud, examined her in 1923, publishing their findings in a paper titled Madame M's delusions were vivid and complex. She believed she was a royal heiress, daughter of Princess Eugene, destined for greatness but persecuted by a shadowy cabal. Her hospital stay, she insisted, was a plot to steal her vast inheritance. She spoke of her doubles, claiming she herself was replaced by a criminal lookalike, while her real self was elsewhere. Her children, she said, were abducted and swapped repeatedly. Over 2,000 doubles in 5 years. To her, this was absolute truth. Couldn't you see the stitch marks on the faces of these imposters, wearing a fabric that concealed their identity? So, what these two stories, more specifically the second story, the main concept in them pertains to the delusional misidentification of people. And this is characterized as a delusional syndrome called Capgras syndrome. People suffering from this syndrome believe that the people close to them have been replaced by a clone, by a robot, by an alien, and that they are clearly imposters. Of course, this causes a lot of confusion and suffering to the people experiencing Capgras syndrome, but also to the people close to them, and it can sometimes be potentially dangerous. This syndrome can result from various factors. It could be due to a psychiatric condition. Normally we are talking about psychotic spectrum conditions such as schizophrenia, but it can also be a result of a traumatic brain injury. In the past, it was thought that it could only happen to women, but now we know that it affects both sexes. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but there is a possibility that Capgras syndrome will become more common as we have an increase in the number of people participating in combat sports where traumatic brain injuries can result in these types of delusional syndromes. But now let's get a little bit more nerdy and get into the neuroscience behind this syndrome. So neuroanatomically, Capgras syndrome is linked to a disrupted connectivity between the temporal lobe, responsible for facial recognition among many other functions, and the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which assigns emotional significance to familiar faces. This disconnection may prevent a normal emotional response associated with recognizing someone familiar, creating a mismatch between visual identification and affective familiarity. Functionally, this is captured by the two-factor theory of delusion, which theorizes that 1. A neuropsychological anomaly causes a strange or anomalous experience, such as recognizing a face without the feeling of familiarity, or it could be a hallucination where there is an actual, very strange visual experience. And then this is followed by a failure in belief evaluation, typically involving frontal lobe dysfunction, which prevents the person from rejecting the implausible belief that the person is an imposter. So basically, we have these two components. First, we have a strange phenomenological or subjective experience, which is followed by a failure to actually interpret that experience. So this means that potentially you can have a very strange visual experience, such as seeing fairies or something else, but not actually believe that those fairies are real. So basically what this theory is arguing is that the anomalous experience is not sufficient to produce a delusional belief. There are criticisms towards this theory, but I think it is a good starting model to begin to conceptualize delusions. Moving on, lesions in the right hemisphere and bifrontal regions have also been observed with neuroimaging studies showing that these areas are functionally connected to regions involved in familiarity processing, more specifically the left retrosplenial cortex and the right frontal cortex for belief evaluation. This is a simplification of the regions involved in belief formation, but we can start from here. But essentially, this dual disruption can result in impaired emotional tagging of recognized faces and result in deficient reality testing. To further complicate this scenario, patients with Capgras delusion do not show any differential autonomic activity to familiar or unknown faces. They consciously recognize the faces of familiar people, so the visual recognition system is intact, but they lack the corresponding autonomic or emotional response that typically signals familiarity. In this situation, we basically show people with Capgras syndrome two images, one image of a person they know and one image of a person they don't know, and then we measure skin conductance. And so for people with Capgras syndrome, the skin conductance reading seems to be the same whether the person they are seeing is someone they know or someone that they don't know. So this dissociation creates a profound sense of estrangement. The face is recognized, but it doesn't feel familiar. And so in an attempt to resolve this mismatch, the person concludes that the person they are seeing, the person that is familiar to them, that they have known for such a long time, must be an imposter. This contrasts with another condition called prosopagnosia, where the conscious recognition system is impaired, but the emotional response remains intact. So patients say that they don't know the person, yet their body reacts as if they do. So at a conscious level, patients with prosopagnosia don't seem to recognize the face of the familiar person that is in front of them, but at a subconscious level, there is a part of them that knows that the person they are seeing is actually someone they have known for a very long time. Now let's get into some psychoanalytic explanations for Capgras syndrome. I like doing this when studying neuroscience because although I tend to adhere to a neuroscientific biological explanation of all of these phenomena, I also like to understand the psychoanalytic dimension and see if we can fit the psychoanalytic explanation with the neurobiological explanation. And sometimes it is interesting to see how both of them actually go a lot against each other, or not. So as previously mentioned, in Capgras syndrome, the mind grapples with a terrible dissonance. A face is recognized, yet feels alien, as if a loved one has been replaced by an impostor. With that in mind, researchers Ellis and Young propose that this delusion arises from a clash between an intact, overt face recognition system and a silent, covert system that fails to provide emotional confirmation, and this leaves people to rationalize the unsettling absence of familiarity. Confronted with a face that looks like a spouse or a parent but lacks the expected affective warmth, patients may conclude that the person is a robot, dummy, or a double. So this is an attempt to make sense of an inexplicable emotional void, of an inexplicable emotional experience. Berson's psychodynamic perspective goes deeper into this, suggesting that Capgras stems from a psychotic regression to primitive thinking, paranoia, and indecision intertwined with four main themes: Oedipal conflicts, feelings of strangeness, ambivalence, and pathological splitting of internalized object representations. Let me explain this better. So within this psychoanalytic perspective, it is argued that this syndrome can serve as a psychological mechanism that allows patients to express hostility towards a perceived imposter without the guilt that would typically accompany aggression towards someone they deeply care about. According to Berson's psychodynamic framework, this delusion involves the so-called process of pathological splitting, where the patient divides their mental representation of a person into two distinct entities. The good side, so the good side of the person they love, and the bad side, which they categorize as the imposter. This split enables the patient to direct negative emotions such as anger or resentment exclusively toward the bad imposter, while preserving their positive feelings for the real person. For example, if a person feels frustrated or threatened by a spouse but is conflicted about harboring such feelings due to love or loyalty, the delusion provides a way to externalize these emotions by attributing them to an external, inauthentic figure. By believing the person before them is not their true loved one, the patient can act with hostility, verbally or even physically, without the emotional burden of guilt, as the imposter is seen as a separate entity deserving of such treatment. I think there are some complications with this psychoanalytic perception, because it is complicated to see how a patient who is experiencing Capgras syndrome is sort of alternating between representing this good and bad side of the person they love, but it definitely is an interesting perspective. Now let's get to another question, which is more philosophical in nature. And this question is, are delusions such as those seen in Capgras syndrome adaptive responses to cognitive crises, or mere malfunctions of thought that have no purpose? Philosophers and psychologists, through the lens of Coulthard and McKay models, debate this question by using the shear-pin hypothesis, which can be metaphorized in the sense that delusions act as sacrificial components, breaking to preserve a cognitive system on the brink of collapse. In the Coulthard model, Capgras delusions arise rationally to explain anomalous data or experiences, such as a lack of emotional familiarity with a loved one's face, but their persistence stems from a dysfunctional inability to revise beliefs against counter-evidence, therefore casting doubt on their adaptiveness. Conversely, the McKay model frames delusions as irrational biases formed at the outset, potentially adaptive in crises, as seen in cases like the reverse Othello syndrome, where a delusion of a loving relationship shields one against despair. Yet both models struggle to generalize. Capgras delusions rarely fit the shear-pin mold, and long-term costs often outweigh short-term psychological relief. Some delusions, like Barbara's divine communications, may temporarily increase self-esteem in the middle of personal turmoil, but their pathological nature, whether defined by harm or dysfunction, remains present. Ultimately, the McKay model allows delusions to be both adaptive and pathological, a duality that the Coulthard model rejects, which leaves us to question whether delusions are a flawed solution to crises or simply broken cogs in the mind's machinery. Overall, for me, as someone who studies neuroscience, these syndromes are fascinating because in their dysfunction, they teach us something about the human mind, about how we perceive the world, about how vulnerable our minds are, but at the same time, they leave us with certain epistemological questions. Throughout this video, I did not make any statements regarding the epistemology of delusions, so here we are defining delusions as false beliefs that are held dogmatically even when counter-evidence or proof of how they are wrong is present, but still there is a complete projection by the person experiencing such delusions. But of course there is a lot of discussion in the field of philosophy of psychiatry where there are some disagreements about the potential epistemic status of hallucinations and delusions, and some of these experiences and perceptions that completely defy the status quo of our regular perceptions and understanding of the world. That being said, I hope you found this video interesting. If you would like me to do more content on the neuroscience of some of these conditions, please let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, consider following the channel. Thank you very much.